We're in 1 Samuel chapter 4 this morning. When I read the Old Testament, I like to remember a couple of verses in the New Testament that tell me why the Old Testament is so important. One of those is Romans chapter 15, verse 4, where Paul the Apostle says, "Whatever things were written before were written for our admonition and our learning, that through the patience and the comfort of the Scriptures, we might have hope." That's in Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Another one is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, where it tells us all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So this morning, as we're in 1 Samuel chapter 4, we know that the Lord has put these verses here for our instruction, for our comfort, for our learning, for our exhortation. And as we come to 1 Samuel chapter 4, we remember the situation that was happening in Israel. They had God's plan from heaven. He had given them the 10 Commandments. He had given them a form of worship, a sacrificial system. He had given them the 10 Commandments and all of these things that were within the tabernacle, that tent of meeting, where the priests would minister to the Lord and give God's opinion and heart about their lives. And yet, as things go sometimes, those spiritual things that God had given to them became mere traditions, habits, patterns. And in the midst of any and all religious activity, they had begun to treat the worship of God as something that was just rote. It didn't really have meaning anymore. It didn't help either that the priests were corrupt. We've just read for a few chapters that they were sleeping around with the women that came, and they were stealing from the people, and they were bullying them and really misrepresenting God. And we read how a couple of people, one man of God, came to Eli, the priest, whose sons were the wicked ones, and corrected him and prophesied that both of these kids would die in one day. They weren't kids, they were men, but they were his kids. And then God would speak to Samuel just as a young boy. And Samuel calls out to the Lord as he calls him in the wee hours of the morning, and God repeats this message that his judgment is coming. And this is going to happen here in chapter 4. And as we read through this, I believe the Lord gives us some hints and directions for us to be on guard against what can happen to any person that loves the Lord and belongs to God. And so we begin in chapter 4, verse 1. And concluding chapter 3, where it says that the Lord revealed himself again by his word, it tells us in verse 1 that the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines and encamped beside Ebenezer. And the Philistines camped in Aphek. They're lined up in battle array against each other. And then it says the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel, and when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army of the field. This is a great defeat. They didn't have a population like we do of 300 plus million. They were a small country, and so 4,000 men, this meant days and days of burials and mournings. We don't know how many people were injured, but Israel can't continue on with defeats like this. And so they suffered an incredible defeat. But notice what it says in verse 3. And when the people had come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines?" Now, a couple of things about the Philistines. At this time in history, we're looking right around 1100 BC. The Philistines were not indigenous to this part of the world. They came from Crete. They were a seafaring people, and they dwelt on the western side of Israel, today the area of Gaza and that area. They are not the modern-day Palestinians. The name of Palestine was given in memory of the Philistines. The Philistines became extinct around 600 BC. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire wiped them out, but they had real power in this area at the time. But Hadrian, around 160 AD, renamed Judea Palestinia in order to displace and separate the Jews who were constantly rebelling against the Roman Empire. But they're not the same people that are there today. The Palestinians that are there today were Arabs, Christians, Jews that have lived there for many, many years, especially during the Ottoman Empire. And when the British Mandate came, everybody in that country was given Palestinian passports. And so it's not just one ethnic group, and they're not connected to these Philistines. But if we think about that time, being that they were on the coastal region, they had access to the technology of the Grecian world, the pre-Grecian world. And so with that, they had begun to enter into the Iron Age before Israel. Israel was inland, and they were farmers, and they were still what we would consider the Bronze Age. But bronze was very expensive. It was very difficult to find. And the Philistines had begun smelting iron. They did all the blacksmithing, and this was kind of technology that gave them a huge advantage. Not only that, the Philistines were a nation of people that had 5 city-states. And in these city-states, they had leaders, and because of their gathering together, they were able to marshal an army much easier than Israel, which was spread out, largely agrarian. And so the Philistines were really beginning to show dominance here. And they were the perennial enemies of Israel for the next number of years. And so it says there that they went out to battle with them and they were defeated. But we notice there in verse 3 that the question of the elders, perhaps you can picture it. They gathered around, they're mourning, they're grieving. Everybody knew somebody who had died. Everybody was likely related to somebody who had passed away. And they asked this question here in verse 3, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? What an interesting question. Sometimes when we have difficulties in our lives, the first thing that we do is we question why God did or didn't do something. I mean, my goodness, on insurance claims, when a disaster comes, we call them acts of God. But this is sort of a silly question. Israel doesn't really have any self-awareness. They don't have any stock of what's happening in their nation. They simply ask, why has God defeated us? And it seems without any sort of prayer or inquiry from Samuel or the Lord, without any repentance, without any turning back from God, they overlooked completely the fact that the nation had become unfaithful. And they came up with a brilliant idea, and I don't mean that seriously. Notice between that sentence there in verse 3 and the next, it says that their conclusion was, let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us. Shiloh was where the tabernacle was, where this artifact, the ark of the covenant was, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of the enemies. And so without any inventory of their spiritual life or self-awareness, they concluded, we've got to get God back on our side. Something's gone wrong. Now, you may know something about the Ark of the Covenant. God, when he led Israel out of the land of Egypt, he met with them at Mount Sinai, and he gave them the workings of their nation. He gave them law. He gave them order. He gave them a whole code of statutes and regulations. But the chief among those were the 10 commandments that God had written with his very finger. And God made a covenant with his people. And he said that if you obey these things, then I will protect you. I'll be your God. My presence will be here. And of course, you remember when they wandered through the wilderness, God was with them. He appeared to them in a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. I mean, what a blessing to have God's presence in such a visible way. And God gave them the instructions for how to put together a tabernacle. A tabernacle just means a tent, and it was this very ornate and beautiful tent, and he gave the keeping of this thing to the tribe of Levi. And they were to pack it up and carry it from place to place where they went, and then unfurl it and stretch it out over the poles. And it had a courtyard, had an altar, it had a laver for washing, and it had a holy place where the priests would enter and they would bake bread every day, 12 loaves, one for each tribe, as a picture of that fellowship with God. Also in the holy place, there would be the menorah or the lampstand that they would feed with oil every day, reminding them of the light of God's presence. They also had a little altar of incense where they would burn incense, and it would have this fragrant aroma to remind them of praise. But within this holy place, there was a final chamber, that holy of holies, where God gave them the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was simply a box made of acacia wood that was overlaid with gold. It was about 4 feet long and just over 2 feet wide and 2 feet high. They were never to touch this box. God had them fasten rings upon it through which poles would be placed, and the priest would carry this from place to place covered. Upon this box was the most valuable piece, or the most valuable part of the tabernacle. It was a lid made of solid gold, 4 feet by 2 feet wide by a few inches thick. And upon this lid, there would be 2 angels, cherubim, Two cherubs, one on one side and one on another, with their arms outstretched, touching in the middle, and their faces looking toward this golden lid, which was called the mercy seat. Why was it called the mercy seat? Well, God had instructed Moses to place a few items within this ark. One of them was those two tablets that God had written with his very finger, the standard of righteousness from God our Father. You will have no other gods before me. And so the word of God was placed in this box. Another thing was placed was a jar of manna. Remember when they were in the wilderness, God brought manna. And that manna was the bread of life. It was their sustenance. It was a reminder that God would provide them bread. Jesus calls himself the bread of life. And so they had a jar of manna. And the third thing that they had there was the rod of Aaron. Do you remember Aaron? He was the brother of Moses, and he was the high priest. And Aaron's staff was placed along the other staffs of the tribes of Israel because there was a time in that wilderness period where some of the men were contentious and they said, we think we should be the high priest. Everybody should be priests of the Lord. And God told Moses, all right, have them all bring their family staffs, that walking stick, and lean it up before the tabernacle. And in the morning, you'll know who I have chosen to be my priest. And in the morning when they came out, all of those broken branches, all of those staffs were all the same except for Aaron's. God had caused Aaron to blossom and grow, and it even bore ripe almonds. And that was God's confirmation that the broken off branch that comes back to life, that's going to be your priest. It's a picture of Jesus, of course. This would be placed there in the Ark of the Covenant. And once a year, the high priest would take a sacrifice and he would enter into this most holy of chambers and he would take the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkle it upon that lid where the angels were gazing upon. The New Testament tells us that the angels long to look into the things that make for our redemption. For all of time, even the angels have been amazed and in awe of God's love and plan for you to be sprinkled with the blood of the sacrifice, Jesus Christ. All of these things spoke about Jesus, but the nation at this time, they didn't have this understanding. They didn't realize that these things were pointing forward to a Messiah, a true high priest, the Lord who would save them. Even today, they don't understand it. And yet, at this time, they took the ark as sort of kind of a lucky charm. Hey, we got to get God back on our side. And if we take the ark out to battle, there's no way we could lose. And Israel, rather than repenting and taking inventory of their lives, they try to get God back on their team, and they use this Ark of the Covenant, what God had given for good, they use it as just a mere religious artifact. Notice in verse 3 where they say, let us bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes, it may save us. They had taken something that God gave to them as an emblem and a symbol that he never meant for them to put their faith in. It was only meant to be something to help them put their faith in him. In fact, in a strange way, they had begun to make the things that God gave them into an idol. It's pretty incredible to think about.